A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
We have spent a lot of time over the last few years talking about the shifting geometry of the sky, but today's prompt from Daniel really forces us to look at the next iteration of that evolution. He is asking about the Arrow 4 interceptor and specifically how it handles Maneuverable Reentry Vehicles, or MaRVs. It feels like we are moving out of the era where missile defense was about hitting a falling rock and into an era where we are trying to catch a bird that is actively trying to dodge us. For decades, the shield was passive, a calculation of parabolas. But as of March 2026, the shield has to become an active hunter.
Herman Poppleberry here, and you are hitting on the fundamental shift in the physics of interception. For decades, the entire architecture of missile defense was built on the predictability of a ballistic arc. If you know the velocity and the angle of a projectile at the edge of space, you can calculate exactly where it will be 5 minutes from now. But once you introduce maneuverability into that reentry vehicle, the math breaks. The Arrow 4 is essentially Israel's answer to the fact that the adversary is no longer content with just falling according to the laws of gravity. We are talking about a transition from Newtonian predictability to a chaotic, non-linear engagement window.
It is a massive leap from the Arrow 3, which was really designed for that pure exo-atmospheric hit-to-kill mission. With Arrow 4, we are seeing a system that has to bridge the gap between the vacuum of space and the thick soup of the atmosphere. Why is that transition so technically difficult? Usually, you optimize an interceptor for one or the other, right? You are either a spacefaring kinetic kill vehicle, or you are an atmospheric surface-to-air missile. Trying to be both seems like an engineering nightmare.
It is an engineering nightmare because the control surfaces you need are completely different. In space, you rely on cold gas thrusters or divert motors because there is no air to push against. You are essentially using tiny rocket engines to nudge yourself left or right. In the atmosphere, those thrusters are fighting against massive air pressure, so you need fins and aerodynamic surfaces to steer. The Arrow 4 is being designed to replace the aging Arrow 2, but it has to carry the sophistication of the Arrow 3 into a much more turbulent environment. The real challenge with a maneuverable reentry vehicle, or MaRV, is that it can change its velocity vector during the terminal phase of its flight. Think about a standard ballistic missile like an older Scud or even a Shahab 3. Once the motor burns out, it is just a passenger on a parabolic curve. But a MaRV has internal guidance and control fins, or even small thrusters, that allow it to perform high-gravity maneuvers as it descends.
So if I am a radar operator and I see a MaRV coming in, my computer predicts it will land at point A. But then the missile performs a lateral shift, and suddenly point A is 5 miles away from the new trajectory. If my interceptor is already committed to point A, it just sails right past into empty air. It is like trying to tackle a running back who can jump sideways 3 yards in the blink of an eye.
That is the nightmare scenario. Traditional interceptors are designed to intercept at a predicted point in space, often called the Predicted Intercept Point, or PIP. If the target moves after the interceptor has made its final course correction, the missed distance becomes too large for a kinetic kill. The Arrow 4 addresses this through what we call an all-aspect seeker and a much more robust divert and attitude control system, or DAC-C. Instead of just looking forward at where the target should be, the seeker on the Arrow 4 can track the target even if the interceptor has to pivot sharply to follow a maneuver. This all-aspect capability means the sensor can maintain a lock even when the missile is not pointed directly at the threat, which is a massive technological hurdle.
I want to dig into that divert and attitude control system because that sounds like the secret sauce here. If the target is pulling 10 or 15 Gs of lateral movement, the interceptor has to be able to match or exceed that maneuverability. but it has to do it while traveling at several times the speed of sound. How do you physically move a missile that fast without it just snapping in half or losing track of the target?
It comes down to energy management and dual-pulse rocket motors. One of the innovations we are seeing in this next generation of interceptors is the ability to save a portion of the solid rocket fuel for the very last second of the engagement. In older systems, the motor burned until it was gone, and then the missile spent the rest of its flight as a glider, losing energy every time it turned. With a dual-pulse motor, the Arrow 4 can keep a second stage of thrust in reserve. When the seeker detects that the MaRV is starting its terminal maneuver, the interceptor can ignite that second pulse to gain the instantaneous thrust needed to close the gap. It is like having a turbo boost that you only use when the target tries to juke you.
That is fascinating because it means the interceptor is essentially playing a game of chicken with the target. It is waiting for the target to commit to a maneuver before it uses its own limited energy to counter it. But that implies a level of sensor fusion that is almost hard to comprehend. You're not just tracking one point, you're tracking a moving target that is actively changing its radar cross-section and its thermal signature as it heats up in the atmosphere. As that MaRV turns, different parts of it face the radar, and the friction of the air creates a plasma sheath that can mess with signals.
The sensor fusion is where the software-defined nature of modern defense really shines. The Arrow 4 is not just relying on its own onboard seeker. It is plugged into the entire Green Pine radar network, and likely feeding off space-based infrared sensors as well. When we talk about the technical architecture, we have to look at the track while scan capabilities. The system has to maintain a high-fidelity lock even when the target is performing non-linear movements. We actually touched on some of the foundational physics of why this is so hard back in episode 1046 when we talked about breaking the arc. Back then, MaRVs were a bit more theoretical for regional actors, but now, in 2026, they are a standard part of the Iranian arsenal. We have seen the Fateh series and the Khorramshahr 4 demonstrate that they can at least attempt these maneuvers.
Right. And it is not just a theoretical threat anymore. We have seen the development of these missiles, and even if some of the hypersonic claims are propaganda, the maneuverability is a real, measurable capability. It feels like the Arrow 4 is a direct response to the fact that the quality of the offensive threat in the Middle East has caught up to the previous generation of defense. If you are Israel, you cannot afford to have a shield that only works against 1980s technology. You need a system that can handle a target that is actively trying to break the geometry of the intercept.
There is a very strong pro-Israel argument to be made here regarding the necessity of this tech. When your adversary is openly calling for your destruction and developing the tools to bypass your current defenses, you have no choice but to innovate. The Arrow 4 represents a multi-billion-dollar bet that Israel can stay ahead of that curve. What is interesting from a technical standpoint is the trade-off between a kinetic kill vehicle and a blast fragmentation warhead. The Arrow 3 was a pure kinetic hit-to-kill system, meaning it had to physically slam into the target to destroy it. That is great in space where there is no air resistance and you have high closing velocities. But against a maneuvering target in the atmosphere, sometimes you want a little bit of a margin for error.
Are you saying the Arrow 4 might go back to a fragmentation warhead? That seems like a step backward in terms of precision, but maybe it is a step forward in terms of probability of kill. If the target is zigzagging, hitting it with a literal bullet becomes nearly impossible.
It is a debate that is happening right now in engineering circles. Some reports suggest the Arrow 4 might utilize a hybrid approach, or a lethality enhancer. If you can get close enough for a kinetic hit, that is always the gold standard because the energy transfer at Mach 10 is enough to vaporize any warhead. But if the MaRV performs a late-stage maneuver that puts it just outside the direct hit zone, having a directed fragmentation charge can still disable the reentry vehicle or knock it off course enough that it misses its intended target. It is about increasing the engagement envelope. In the thick of the atmosphere, the shock wave from a fragmentation blast is much more effective than it is in the vacuum of space.
That makes sense. It is like the difference between trying to hit a baseball with a bullet versus trying to hit it with a shotgun blast. One is more impressive, but the other is a lot more likely to stop the runner from scoring. I am curious about the latency aspect of this. If the interceptor is making these decisions in real time, how much of that is autonomous? I imagine at those speeds, a human in a command center in Palmachim cannot possibly be making the course corrections. By the time the signal reaches the ground and the operator moves a joystick, the missile has already traveled 3 miles.
It is entirely autonomous once the interceptor is launched. The fire control system on the ground handles the initial mid-course guidance, sending updates to the missile about where the target is. But once the onboard seeker goes active, the missile's own computer is the pilot. This is where the AI-driven fire control systems come in. The algorithms have to predict not just where the target is, but the probability of various maneuvers the target might make based on its current velocity and altitude. It is basically playing a high-speed game of chess. If the target moves left, what is the most efficient way for the interceptor to move to maintain an intercept path while preserving enough energy for a potential move back to the right? The AI is running thousands of simulations per second to find the optimal path.
That is where the computational latency becomes the bottleneck, rather than just the rocket motor. If your processor takes an extra 20 milliseconds to calculate the new intercept geometry, you might have already traveled half a football field in the wrong direction. We often think about these things in terms of hardware, but the Arrow 4 is really a flying supercomputer. It is a piece of silicon with a rocket strapped to it.
It really is. And when you look at the second-order effects of this, it changes the entire strategic calculus of the region. If Israel can demonstrate a reliable defense against maneuverable reentry vehicles, it devalues the primary offensive investment of its neighbors. This is a very pro-American and pro-Israel perspective, but a strong defense is fundamentally stabilizing. If an aggressor knows their most advanced missiles will be swatted out of the sky, they are less likely to launch them in the first place. It restores the deterrent balance that was starting to lean toward the offense as MaRV technology proliferated.
Although the counter-argument to that is usually that it just kicks off the next phase of the arms race, right? If the Arrow 4 can catch a MaRV, then the adversary starts looking at hypersonic glide vehicles that stay lower in the atmosphere and maneuver even more aggressively. It feels like we are in this permanent cycle where the shield gets thicker and the sword gets sharper. If you can't go over the shield, you try to go under it or around it.
That is exactly the cycle we are in. But the Arrow 4 is designed with that in mind. By making it a multi-mission interceptor that can operate both inside and outside the atmosphere, Israel is trying to create a system that is future-proof against those lower altitude threats. It is very similar to the United States THAAD system, which stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. THAAD is designed to hit targets in that same transitional zone, the endo-exo-atmospheric interface. The difference is that the Arrow 4 is being built to handle much longer range threats than THAA was originally optimized for. It is combining the reach of a strategic interceptor with the agility of a tactical one.
I remember in episode 1392, we talked about the Shield of the Levant and how integrated these layers are. You have Iron Dome for the short stuff, David's Sling for the medium range, and then Arrow for the big ballistic threats. Where does Arrow 4 fit into that stack? Is it just a replacement for Arrow 2, or does it overlap with Arrow 3? It seems like the lines are getting blurred between these layers.
It is going to overlap significantly. The goal is to have a seamless transition where the system can hand off a target from one layer to the next. If Arrow 3 misses a target in deep space because the target deployed decoys or performed a maneuver, the Arrow 4 is the backstop that can engage it as it re-enters the upper atmosphere. It provides that extra layer of redundancy. What is really impressive is the all-aspect seeker I mentioned earlier. Most interceptors have to be pointed almost directly at the target for the seeker to see it, which limits how much they can maneuver. The Arrow 4 seeker has a much wider field of view, which allows the missile to fly more efficient intercept paths. It doesn't have to keep its nose pointed directly at the target until the very end.
So it can essentially fly to a point in space while looking sideways at the target, and then pivot at the last second. That saves a massive amount of drag and energy, because you aren't constantly fighting the air to keep the seeker centered. That is a huge engineering win. It allows the missile to maintain its velocity for much longer.
It really is. And it speaks to the sophistication of the Israeli defense industry working alongside American partners like Boeing. This isn't just a local project, it is a massive collaborative effort that benefits both nations. The data we get from these systems informs the next generation of American interceptors as well. It is a symbiotic relationship where the front line of the conflict serves as the ultimate testing ground for the most advanced technology on Earth. The Arrow 4 is essentially the laboratory for the future of global missile defense.
It is also worth noting that the political will to push these boundaries often come from a worldview that prioritizes technological superiority as a means of preventing war. If you have the best shield, you don't have to use your sword as often. We saw this during the previous decade where funding for these systems was prioritized as a way to avoid the necessity of preemptive strikes. If you can absorb the blow, you aren't forced to strike first.
I think that is a very fair assessment. When you look at the history of the Arrow program, it has always been about staying one half step ahead of the threat. The Arrow 2 was revolutionary when it came out because it was one of the first systems designed specifically to intercept theater ballistic missiles. Then Arrow 3 moved that intercept point into space. Now Arrow 4 is filling the gap that the adversary tried to exploit with maneuverability. It is a constant game of cat and mouse, but the cat is getting much smarter. The cat now has predictive algorithms and dual pulse motors.
One thing that always strikes me about these discussions is how much we focus on the missile itself, but the radar and the fire control are really where the battle is won or lost. If the Green Pine radar can't distinguish between a MaRV and a piece of debris or a decoy, the best interceptor in the world is useless. How is the Arrow 4 handling the decoy problem? Because if you have a maneuverable vehicle, you can also have maneuverable decoys.
That is the ultimate challenge. Discriminating between a lethal warhead and a lightweight balloon or a piece of the booster is incredibly difficult once you are in the vacuum of space. But once you hit the atmosphere, physics starts to help the defender. The atmosphere acts as a giant filter. Lightweight decoys slow down much faster than a heavy, dense warhead because of air resistance. This is why the Arrow 4's ability to engage in the upper atmosphere is so critical. It waits for the atmosphere to peel away the decoys and then it engages the true threat. It is using the physical properties of the reentry environment as a sensor.
So, by moving the intercept point slightly lower than where the Arrow 3 operates, you are actually making the identification task easier, even if the flight time is shorter and the pressure is higher. You are using the Earth's own atmosphere as a physical separator. That is a brilliant way to solve a sensor problem with physics.
The trade-off, of course, is that you have less time to react. If you wait for the atmosphere to sort out the decoys, you might only have 30 or 40 seconds left before impact. That brings us back to the need for that incredible acceleration and maneuverability we discussed. You have to be able to go from 0 to Mach 8 or 9 in a matter of seconds, and then perform a high G turn to hit a target that is trying to dodge you. The Arrow 4 has to be faster, smarter, and tougher than anything that came before it, because it is operating in the most unforgiving part of the flight path.
It is a high-stakes game of chicken. I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the practical takeaways for our listeners. When people see headlines about new missile tests or defensive systems, it can feel very abstract. But what the Arrow 4 represents is the total digitalization of the battlefield. The hardware is almost secondary to the algorithms. If you are tracking this space, the thing to watch isn't just the size of the rocket. It is the developments in multi-pulse propulsion and sensor fusion.
I agree. The real indicator of capability in the next decade will be energy management. Can your interceptor perform multiple maneuvers without losing its ability to steer? That is why the dual pulse motor is such a big deal. It is the difference between a car that has one gear and a car that can downshift for a burst of speed. For anyone interested in the technical side, I would also recommend looking into the role of gallium nitride, or GaN, in the radar systems. That is what allows these radars to have the power and sensitivity to track these small, fast-moving targets at such immense ranges. Without GaN, the Green Pine wouldn't have the resolution to see the difference between a MaRV's fin and a piece of space junk.
And from a strategic perspective, it is a reminder that the defense never actually wins, it just keeps the game going. There is no such thing as a perfect shield, but there is such a thing as a shield that is good enough to change the adversary's behavior. If Arrow 4 works as advertised, it forces the other side to spend 10 times as much money trying to find a new way around it. It is an economic attrition strategy, as much as a military one.
It is the ultimate tax on the aggressor. You are forcing them to innovate in increasingly expensive and complex ways just to maintain the same level of threat they had 10 years ago. In the long run, that is an economic war that a vibrant, tech-heavy economy like Israel's is much better equipped to win than a more closed, sanctioned economy like Iran's. It is a form of soft power backed by very hard kinetic energy. We are seeing the same thing with the United States and its development of the next generation interceptor. The cost of entry for the offense is skyrocketing.
We should also mention the human element. The people designing these systems are some of the brightest minds in the world, and many of them are working in a very high-pressure environment where a single mistake can have catastrophic consequences. The psychological impact of knowing you have a reliable shield above your head cannot be overstated for a civilian population. It changes the way a society functions under threat.
We saw that with the Iron Dome, but the Arrow system is the same concept on a much larger, more existential scale. If an Iron Dome battery fails, a house might get hit. If an Arrow battery fails, an entire city center could be at risk. The stakes are as high as they get. That is why the Arrow 4 is being developed with such a high degree of rigor. It is not just about technical excellence, it is about national survival. The margin for error is zero.
It also makes me think back to our episode 997 on the human shield aspect. We talked about how the Arrow system isn't just hardware, it is a distributed network of people and machines. The Arrow 4 is going to integrate into that even more deeply. The decision loops are getting tighter, and the role of the human operator is shifting from a pilot to a supervisor of a very complex autonomous system. The human is there to set the parameters, but the machine is the one doing the Mach 10 math.
That is the future of all high-end warfare. The speed of the engagement has surpassed the speed of human thought. Our job now is to build the systems that can think for us in those critical seconds, and then hope we have programmed them with the right priorities. The Arrow 4 is a testament to that vision. It is an incredibly complex answer to a very simple, albeit terrifying problem: how do you stop a rock falling at 3 kilometers per second when that rock can decide to move?
It is the ultimate engineering challenge. I think we have covered the core of why this system is such a leap forward. It is the combination of dual pulse propulsion, all aspect seekers, and the ability to operate in that difficult transitional zone between space and the atmosphere. It is a direct counter to the MaRV threat and a significant piece of the puzzle for regional stability. But as we have seen, the looming question remains: can any defense system truly keep up with the proliferation of low-altitude, high-maneuverability threats like hypersonic gliders?
That is the question that will define the next 20 years. The Arrow 4 is a massive step, but it is not the final step. The adversary is already looking at how to stay even lower, to hide in the clutter of the Earth's curvature. But for now, the Arrow 4 ensures that the current generation of high-altitude maneuverable threats can be met with a credible defense. It is a reminder that in the world of missile defense, if you are standing still, you are actually moving backward. The adversary is always iterating, so the defender has to iterate faster. The Arrow 4 is Israel's way of saying they intend to keep winning that race.
Well, I think that is a good place to wrap up the technical deep dive. It is a fascinating look at how the laws of physics are being harnessed to solve some of the most complex security problems on the planet. Daniel, thanks for the prompt. It really allowed us to dig into the nuances of what makes this next generation of interceptors so special. It is easy to look at a rocket and just see a tube of fire, but the reality is so much more complex.
It was a great one. These are the kinds of topics where the more you look at the details, the more you realize how incredible the engineering actually is. It is not just a rocket, it is a masterpiece of physics and software. It is the pinnacle of what we can achieve when we push the limits of materials science and computational speed.
Before we head out, we have to give a big shout out to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the show running smoothly behind the scenes. And a huge thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the research and generation of this show. We couldn't do this without that kind of raw computational power. It takes a lot of processing to keep up with Herman's technical deep dives.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these deep dives useful, we would love it if you could leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps other people discover the show and keeps us motivated to keep digging into these weird and wonderful prompts. We love the technical stuff, so keep those prompts coming.
You can also find all our past episodes and ways to subscribe at myweirdprompts.com. We have a massive archive covering everything from the physics of space to the latest in AI and geopolitics. If you want to hear more about the foundational tech, definitely go back and check out episode 1046.
Thanks for listening. We will be back soon with another deep dive into whatever Daniel or the rest of you send our way. The world is full of weird and wonderful engineering, and we are just getting started.
See you then.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to